part of the big news last week, John, was Kodai Senga being optioned to the minors. And I think for some, while I do think this was the right move, and I want to be clear about my feelings on it, I think it was the right move. It was a stunning move for a guy who was supposed to be the ace of the team this season. So what do you think went into that decision? And do you believe that he can get back to form where he was more efficient with his pitches? And do you think there's a solution to him overcoming some of the issues that we've seen with him thus far this season?
First, let me say just hats off to Kodai Senga for accepting the option or the assignment to AAA. He doesn't have to in his contract. Obviously, as fans, we all like to see a guy come out here and acknowledge that they're not helping the team. But not every person does it. And because of his contract, it's within his right to not accept it. I didn't think for a second, though, that he wouldn't, because he seems like a team first guy. Everything he said along the way was just the right thing, right? I want to help this team before it happened. And I know the reports came out that the Mets, sort of collaborated with Senga and came up with a plan, and he felt very respected throughout the process. He didn't just feel like, well, we have the ability to do it, and so we're going to try to coerce you into going down to AAA. So hats off to him for accepting it. Also, to your point from earlier, hats off to the organization for acknowledging and showing the urgency. They could make that move. It wasn't going to be the easiest thing to do, but hey, we can do it. The player can do it. And we think it's going to be what's best for the player and for the team in the long run. As far as Kodai getting it back, I think he's very capable of doing it. Before he got hurt, he was one of the best pitchers in the National League. All the numbers bore that out. Every once in a while, he'd have these bad first innings or whatever, but that seems to be par for the course. When we're talking about Kodai Senga, he would settle in. The whiffs were there. The fastball looked good. The ghost fork is one of the most unhittable pitches in the sport. He goes down. He hasn't been the same since. But again, if you look under the hood, this doesn't look like a guy who is not right there with his stuff, who doesn't have his normal fastball and his normal break. It looks like a guy who is having a little bit of difficulty executing and commanding. And I think executing and commanding can be fixed even for seasoned major leaguers, or I guess in Kodai Senga's case, seasoned pros. And so I think this is something that with a start or two in AAA, with less eyes on him and just focusing on putting in the work where the win-loss record isn't skewed, especially in a pennant race, I think he's going to come back, and I think he's going to help this team in a major way if they make the playoffs. I think they will, but right now there's no guarantee. I think he can help this team, and I think he'll be back here sooner rather than later, 1 or 2 starts in AAA.
All right, so positivity around Kodai Senga. You're right, John. No guarantee that they will make the playoffs. We'll get to that a little bit later. Got to talk about another pitcher who's been having some issues. That is Ryan Helsley. And I know bringing his name up with Mets fans right now is not popular. I see you hanging your head there, John. Not popular. I see it, okay?
I want to love Ryan Helsley so much, man.
I know. I understand. And I was talking with John Heyman about this a couple of weeks ago. So this is 2 episodes ago. And I was saying, like, look, he's been shaky. And John told me that was me putting it nicely since he arrived in Flushing. But how much patience should the Mets have with him here down the stretch? And what needs to change for him to be reliable? Because that's the thing. You want to like him. You said, John, you want to rely on him. But what has to change for him to be reliable? And can the Mets trust him? How much should they trust him here down the stretch?
I know this isn't a great answer. I don't know, to be completely honest with you. I like to think I know baseball pretty well. I'm not a sports scientist. I'm not a sports psychologist. I've never been a pitching coach. I've never pitched at the major league level. So there are limitations to my knowledge as far as how to get him right. I will say this, though. The Mets need him to be the guy that they acquired at the deadline, the guy who had 49 saves for the St. Louis Cardinals last year, the guy who has been lights out for pretty much his entire career. I know his fastball was getting hit a little bit more earlier this season prior to the trade, despite the fact that he's still throwing 101 miles an hour. But all of that notwithstanding, they need him to be the guy that they went out and got. So what can they do? he has to be tipping. There has to be something about this tipping of pitches, and I know people have talked about it ad nauseum at this point. Even other former Mets players have weighed in on it. I know Trevor May did a whole thing about Ryan Helsley tipping pitches. I think in talking to some former major leaguers myself, they said one of the most detrimental things a pitcher can do is tip, believe it or not. And I mentioned Luis Severino earlier and the great year that he had for the Mets, coming off of the abysmal year that he had for the Yankees, where he pitched to like a 6.65 ERA. And I remember talking to two players, a former pitcher and a former hitter, both of whom played for the Mets, and they said, there's no shot he's not tipping. You can't have the fastball velocity that Severino has, which is still at that time among the top in baseball for starting pitchers, and the break on all the off-speed stuff. It was all still there. It was sharp, and guys sitting on these pitches and turning them around, turning 100 miles an hour around in Ryan Helsley's case, and putting it in the second deck. You have to be showing your hand, quite literally. So I don't know how they fix it, because I know they've made some adjustments with where he holds his hands and how he, flies open his glove hand, depending on what pitch he's going to throw. I think now there's also just a crisis of confidence. I think we're getting into first season with the Mets Edwin Diaz territory, where every mistake Edwin Diaz made was a home run. Every mistake Ryan Helsley makes either goes out of the park, or it's an extra base hit, or he walks people. So everything is just an absolute mess for him. My solution would be, you just have to put him, and I know there's not a lot of low leverage situations with like 19 games left to go in the season as you're fighting for a playoff spot, but I think you have to put him in the lowest leverage possible. You have to hope that your major league coaches can unlock something as far as this tipping goes. He gets a little bit of his confidence back, but I see the people on Mets Twitter, I see the people, just the fans everywhere, calling to DFA him. You cannot trade for a guy at the trade deadline and DFA him. I cannot think of the last time any team has done that within the same season, and especially a relief pitcher who, as quickly as they can lose it sometimes, they can find it again. And this guy should be able to help you. And if the Mets are going to go where they want to go in the playoffs, they're going to need Ryan Helsley to be Ryan Helsley.
They are, but if he's not right, John, there will be, and I agree, the DFA stuff is ridiculous. Like, that's
you can't. You
can't give up what they gave up for him and do that. But considering what they gave up for him, right? Some people are going to say, and someone asked me this question, I had to actually think about it, but I still think there's a chapter to be written on this. With the way he's performed, do you think that this is the acquiring of him is the worst Mets in-season trade since Darren Ruff a couple of years ago?
I mean, Darren Ruff wasn't that long ago, so it has to be the worst since Darren Ruff. I know there were some guys they brought in last year that, no one was spectacular, but I say this often on our show. You can't compare deadline acquisitions to Yoenis Cespedes in 2015, because that was not only, maybe the best one the Mets have ever made in their history, but one of the best deadline acquisitions in terms of the numbers that were put up for the new team in Major League history. I think a lot of people gloss over when we traded for Javier Baez a couple of years later, and they don't look back at it as fondly because Baez didn't lead the team to the playoffs and the Mets fell short and they didn't bring him back. But Baez was also on an absolute tear. So the Mets have hit on some of these big acquisitions in the past. I know those are from the offensive side, but I think this is, this has got to be the worst. This one might be worse than Darren Ruff just because of the expectations. Adjusted for expectations, Darren Ruff was brought in here to hit lefties, something he did for his whole career and didn't really do here, but that's like a platoon DH spot for Darren Ruff. Maybe a couple starts at first base if he's really going hot and you could get Pete Alonso off his feet, but Helsley was brought in here to be the setup man for Edwin Diaz, and he's pitching to like an 11.75 ERA.
Crazy. Crazy times. Crazy times.
So bad.
I want to go. Yeah. Okay. I want to go back to the starters. It is bad. I know it's rough. We had to get through that question, so we did.
I know.
But we've seen reports that the Mets may use piggyback starters down the stretch. Do you think that's a smart strategy, or do you look at it and say, hey, this speaks to a larger problem with the rotation's depth? Like, how do you view that if they go with piggyback starters?
I think it speaks to a larger problem to the rotation's depth, but I also don't think that there's anything else you can do now because there's like 20 games left. So, the trade deadline is passed. They've called up all of the pitchers who were major league ready, and maybe in the case of Tong, somebody who was just short of major league ready to try to fill this out as far as the rotation goes. So I think piggybacking starters is a good idea for the personnel that the Mets have right now. I think going into the 2026 season, there's a different conversation to be had. But right now, you can't worry about 2026. You can't worry about hurting people's feelings. You can't worry about evaluating players, whether those are players coming back from injury or, inability in the case of Kodai Senga, or that's players who are coming up, Jonah Tong or Brandon Sprode or Nolan McLean. I think you have to deploy your 26-man roster, or at least right now your 28-man roster, as best as you possibly can to win as many games as possible to try to put yourself in the best position you can for the playoffs. So I would piggyback these guys. I think there's a lot of people who are candidates for it. Sean Manaea, for instance, looks like a guy who just hasn't really been able to get up to speed physically. I know he's got the bone chips in his elbow, but his season didn't start the way we all wanted it to. He missed basically the first half. He comes back. He's got the bone spurs. He gets fatigued after 2 or 3 innings. To me, that feels like an opener. To me, that feels like a guy who can come in the middle of a game if you want him to come out of the pen because he has experience doing it. So maybe the solution is you start a Kodai Senga and you let him go 2 innings, and then you bring in Manaea for 2 or 3 or 4 or however long he's effective and throwing hard. Same thing with Clay Holmes. You can look at Clay Holmes, and I was bullish on the signing when they made it to make him be a starter. I thought it would work, and kudos to him. It's worked tremendously. But I also thought that the Mets should have shortened him up and put him in the bullpen a month ago. And they've resisted doing that. They haven't had the personnel in the starting rotation to be able to do that. But at the same time, I think you see with Clay Holmes, people are saying like, oh, well, he was good today. And it's like, yeah, he had to gut it out though, just to get to 5 innings, that is. And then it's the walks, there's the fatigue, there's the laboring. He's a guy, again, who seems like the perfect candidate, a guy who knows how to pitch out of the bullpen, use an opener or use a starter, a piggyback situation, and then go to Clay Holmes later on. I think the 2 ideal guys down the stretch, and certainly in the playoffs, if they make it there and they're still having some of these issues as far as starting pitchers are concerned, I think Manaea and Holmes are perfect candidates to go into the bullpen because they've done it before.